talks about the different streams of neoconservatism. He's the editor of a collection of essays from politicians and columnists in the Neocon Reader. He's joined at this discussion by the Weekly Standard's William Crystal. This is an hour and a half.
Great. Okay, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Kenneth Weinstein, Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Hudson Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you and also C-SPAN's Book TV to today's book forum. The forum's entitled The Future of Neoconservatism, and this is for Erwin Stelzer's edited volume, The Neocon Reader, which is published by Grove Press. This is an important volume of reflection on contemporary American political thought, featuring many of the leading lights of neoconservatism. Thinkers like Irving Kristol, John Bolton, James Q. Wilson, David Brooks, Adam Wolfson, Gene Kirkpatrick, and including Bill Kristol, including our panelists today, such as Bill Kristol, Erwin Stelzer, and João Espada. And books, I should add, will be available for purchase and signing by the editor after today's forum ends. And Neoconservatism, you will recall, emerged as an intellectual force in the late 1960s and early 1970s in reaction to the excesses of liberalism, the rise of the counterculture, the failure of efforts at social engineering by the welfare state, and a blame America first approach to American foreign policy. But what began as a movement some 30 years ago among intellectuals and among academics and would-be academics writing for such publications as Commentary and the Public Interest, in the last few years has become, if you believe the conspiracy theorists on the internet and much of the mainstream European press, the dominant force driving American foreign and domestic policy. Leading America, as Erwin Stelzer notes in his magisterial introduction to this volume, leading America, and here I quote Erwin, to abandon its traditional foreign policy and become a unilateralist, imperialist hegemon, and to control domestic policy as well on issues from stem cell research to tax cuts. The great merit of this edited volume is that it shows the intellectual origins of neoconservatism and the genuine diversity of neoconservative views on both foreign and domestic policy, as well as how individuals not normally associated with neoconservatism, such as incoming Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and British Prime Minister Tony Blair, how they themselves have become influenced by neoconservative policy concerns. So we will explore the future of neoconservatism on the eve of the second George W. Bush administration with its ambitious domestic and foreign policy agendas with our three distinguished panelists, the editor of the Neocon Reader, Erwin Stelzer, who is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute and director of our economic policy studies, who will focus on domestic policy, William Crystal, the editor of the Weekly Standard and chairman of the Project for the New American Century, who will examine foreign policy, and João Espada, who is director of the Institute for Political Studies at the Catholic University of Portugal. Now, João is not simply here for purposes of ethnic diversity, though I'm sure that we will certainly discuss during the questions and answers, if not before, the role of Jews and support for Israel in neoconservatism during the question period, but primarily really to examine the prospects for neoconservatism in Europe. Each participant will have about 7 minutes or so to make an opening remark, and afterwards we'll open to questions from the audience. In the interest of disclosure, I should note that I am a contributor to the Neocon Reader with a chapter entitled Leo Strauss, His Thought, and the Iraq War. Now, I wrote this chapter primarily to clear up the notion, especially prevalent, I believe, really in the European press, and again among these internet conspiracy theorists, that Leo Strauss was somehow the mad genius behind the Iraq War and the philosopher king of the neocons. Though I supported the war and still do, I thought it necessary when I started writing this chapter to separate Strauss's legacy from the outcome of the war, whether the war would go well or would be more difficult. And I sat down to write this chapter about a year ago. This was my main concern. Let me just rapidly pass through the main points in my essay. Okay, Leo Strauss died in 1973 after a lifetime of interpretation of philosophical texts, trying to recover these texts for their insights on for contemporary man. Strauss did not write about public policy per se, and it is extraordinarily difficult to ascertain what Strauss's own position of the war might have been. And this is obviously complicated by the fact that Strauss's writings themselves, as often been noted, are immensely complicated. Point number two, though, most of the Straussians, that's to say Strauss's students and the students of those students, supported the Iraq War. Not all Straussians did. Nothing in Strauss's writing dictated support of the war per se, and among the prominent Straussians opposed to the war were Nathan Tarkoff of the University of Chicago and Pierre Manent of the École des Études en Sciences Sociales. That being said, though there were Straussian supporters and opponents of the war, support for the war to overthrow Saddam Hussein seems to have had several bases in Strauss's own thought. First, of course, was Strauss's attempt to revive awareness of the danger of tyranny, both for the dangers it posed and to challenge the notion of value-free social science for its inability to critique tyranny. Second, following Aristotle, Strauss stressed the importance of the regime, the ordering of offices in the ancient city, to shaping the way of life of the polis. And as Bill Crystal and Steve Lenzner argued in a wonderful piece in The Public Interest, President Bush's advocacy of regime change, they note, is, quote, not altogether unworthy product of Strauss's rehabilitation of the notion of regime. So, aside from a focus on tyranny and the regime, a third Straussian element that seems to be in play in this question is the recognition that in a clash with totalitarian or authoritarian regimes, liberal democracies need to act, as it were, against character and be constantly vigilant. So these are if there are Straussian bases, I would say these are the prevalent ones in support of the war. But I think there are also numerous theoretical justifications in Strauss's own understanding of politics to think that Strauss, an anti-utopian, might have been skeptical of parts of the enterprise of the war, especially the notion that regime change could help, as some supporters of the war have believed, to bring democracy to Iraq. And here, a focus on Strauss's reading of Aristotle's politics may be helpful. Though the regime is the primary fact about politics, it is, as Aristotle and Strauss both note, not the only fact about politics. And here I turn to Strauss's own reading of Book 3 of Aristotle's Politics. And in Book 3 of the Politics, Aristotle compares the founder of the regime, the man who gives it order, to a sculptor who gives form to matter. And that matter, Strauss notes, as does Aristotle, has distinct limitations as to what form it can take, whether through a founding or a refounding after wartime. And I frankly find it hard to believe that Strauss would have thought the Iraqi people as good matter for liberal democracy. Moreover, Strauss's own knowledge of the fragility of democracy and its rise in early modern political philosophy against theological claims to political sovereignty might have served as a warning of the enormous challenges that would lie ahead. So in sum, those who opposed the war in Iraq and who would blame Leo Strauss's influence for the war would do well to look elsewhere, perhaps even to Strauss's own writings and the classics he sought to revive, for their view that there are distinct limitations to the form that a post-Saddam Iraq might take. One last note, others have noted, following convicted felon Lyndon LaRouche, that just as Plato used the noble lie in the Republic to prop up the regime of the Republic, that Straussians promoted a myth of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in order to manipulate support for the war. This charge, frankly, fails the laugh test. It doesn't do justice to the dignity with which Strauss treats the challenge of democratic statesmanship, but moreover, it really abstracts from the pre-war situation in which every major intelligence agency, including the French, the Russians, and even the Egyptians, though not a major agency, believed Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. So, that being said, by way of introduction, I will now turn it over to our speakers, each of whom will speak for somewhere around 7 minutes, and then we'll break for questions and answers. Erwin Stelzer needs no introduction. He is Hudson's Director of Economic Policy Studies, just one of the many hats he wears. A man who is as prolific as he is insightful, which is a rare commodity in this town and every other. And as I mentioned earlier, I would urge everyone to purchase this book simply to read Erwin's magisterial introduction. His counsel is well sought out by political leaders and business leaders in America and in Europe. He is contributing editor to the Weekly Standard, columnist for the Sunday Times of London, member of the Publications Committee of the Public Interest, and a distinguished economist who has taught at, among other places, Cornell, NYU, and Oxford.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much, Ken. I'd like to begin by thanking all the people who wrote essays. I see Carlin is here and Adam is here, and I really appreciate that. And then there are three people who did really the work. Sita, my wife, Lara Gonzalez, and Tony Allen, who has been associated with me for more years than either of us care to remember, I think. Let me just tell you a little bit of the origins of the book and then try to hit on the domestic policy stuff. It began really when I've been spending a lot of time in Europe, especially in London, and the enormous hostility toward American policy, toward the president personally, I thought was based on ignorance. Seemed plausible, and therefore, if you dispel ignorance, you will dispel some of the hostility. I think the book dispelled the ignorance. It didn't succeed in doing anything much about the hostility, which seems to survive education. Why it's there, very hard to say. It's easy in France. It's envy. I was interviewed, of course, after the book came out, by some French journalist who went through all my objections quite calmly and then said, "But tell the truth. Do you really believe that English cheeses are better than French cheeses?" And I felt this was the important point for this journalist. Whether it's got to do with gods, guns, and gays, I don't know. I do think there's the notion that we have common cultural values with Western Europe is, in my judgment, a myth. We don't, and I think that myth will have to be dispelled before we can proceed. Also, I thought that it would be possible to dispel the notion that this was a Jewish conspiracy led by Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice and the Christian right, that Bill Kristol and PNAC were responsible for wars that existed before Bill was born, but certainly PNAC, with which Bill was associated, as you know, is considered still the absolute horror for Europeans. And in one newspaper, I believe it was, because of the Weekly Standard and the the AEI are in one building, they published a picture of the building just in case any crazed Muslim fanatic couldn't read the address. Anyhow, in that sense, the book is a failure, as you'll notice the remainders outside. But I've been asked to talk about the domestic part and leave to Bill the foreign policy stuff, which is a reasonable division of labor, since he has a tougher road to hoe than I do at the moment. I think the best way to understand it, the domestic policy, is to distinguish it from conservatism, from more traditional conservatism, or from things with which traditional conservatives are comfortable. I'll give you three examples and then make one comment and sit down. Neoconservatism starts with acceptance of the existence of the welfare state and concentrates on ways to improve it. That's doctrined by Irving Kristol in one of his chapters here. And in most instances, this is to be accomplished, this acceptance but improvement in the welfare state, by using incentives, by providing incentives to work instead of be on the dole, by providing incentives to marriage, not using coercion, the coercive power of the state, but getting the incentives right. Now, that, of course, brings us to Social Security, which isn't covered in the book, and whether President Bush's plan to, I was trying to find a word other than reform, to alter Social Security meets Irving Kristol's test as an improvement in the welfare state, or as a major assault on it, is something neoconservatives are puzzling over and don't agree about at all. So accept the welfare state, which a lot of conservatives have had difficulty doing over time. That would be one distinction. Another is that neoconservatives start